In a small town surrounded by the deep forests of Kentucky, a strange and dramatic story unfolds about a young girl who suddenly disappeared mysteriously, leaving behind her beloved red Pontiac with signs of a life-and-death struggle. The car door was left slightly ajar, her phone abandoned mid-call during an emergency 911 plea, and traces of panic scattered everywhere. What happened next was nothing short of a detective novel, as it seemed unbelievable that something like this could happen in real life. It took 15 years to finally uncover the truth, and when it did, everyone was outraged and deeply shocked. Welcome to True Crime Time, where we take you through the most captivating stories of mysterious cases from around the world. Our main character today is Jessica Disan, born on May 2, 1982, in the small town of Sefview, Kentucky, USA. This is a quiet place where many residents engage in farming, and everyone knows each other. Jessica had 2 younger brothers, and from a young age, she helped her parents take care of them while they worked. This made Jessica more independent, and her parents could always rely on her. At the age of 15, Jessica started working part-time at a local restaurant to save money for her first car. She dreamed of owning a red Pontiac, and a few years later, she had saved enough to make that dream a reality. Despite working part-time, Jessica excelled in her studies and began planning for college to become an accountant. In the fall of 1999, at the age of 17, Jessica entered her senior year of high school. She had also started dating a boy and was very excited about it. On the morning of Friday, September 10th, Jessica's day began as usual. Her parents left for work while she was still asleep. Her younger brothers went to the bus stop and headed to school. Jessica stayed home, planning to drive to school after they left. Around noon, her mother returned home and immediately noticed something unusual. Jessica's car was parked in front of the house, even though she should have been in class by that time. The mother walked into the house and headed to her daughter's room. Her initial thought was that Jessica might have overslept and missed school, but she wasn't in her bedroom. Next, the mother thought that Jessica might have asked her father to give her a ride to school, so she called him, but he said that he had gone to work as usual that morning. Thinking there might be an issue with Jessica's car, her mother took the spare keys from the house to try and start it. However, as she approached the car, she saw a disturbing scene. First, the driver's side door was slightly open. Secondly, and even more concerning, was Jessica's cell phone lying on the seat with the digits 9 and 1 on the screen. Under the front seat was one of Jessica's shoes, along with her keys, and on the back seat were her school books, work clothes, and her purse. Her mother immediately feared the worst. It was clear that someone had attempted to dial 911 on Jessica's phone, but hadn't completed the call. Additionally, Jessica would never have left all her belongings in the car and simply walked off. The family lived in the outskirts of town, so she would have had to walk miles along the road. Jessica's parents called the school, only to hear that their daughter hadn't shown up to class that day. Somehow, the school had failed to notify them, as they were supposed to. Hours later, Jessica's best friend from the restaurant where they both worked called her parents to say that Jessica hadn't shown up for her shift, heightening their concern. Worried about Jessica's absence from both school and work, and the fact that her belongings, including her phone with 9 and 1 dialed, had been left in the car, her parents decided to call the police. However, the sheriff simply suggested that Jessica might have wandered off and would eventually return home. He didn't even pay attention to the fact that one of her shoes was left behind in the car, making it unlikely that she could have gone far without it. Jessica's parents tried to convince the sheriff that their daughter might be in danger, but despite their pleas, he refused to open an investigation. Left with no other choice, they returned home. Determined to take matters into their own hands, Jessica's parents reached out to family members, friends, and acquaintances, but no one had seen her. Together, they began searching the town for Jessica, but she was nowhere to be found. The next morning, Jessica's parents went back to the sheriff, telling him that Jessica still hadn't returned home. This time he sent 2 officers to inspect her car, but her parents encountered another problem. The officers didn't wear gloves, touching everything inside the car with their bare hands. They also didn't search Jessica's room, even though that was standard procedure. Once again abandoned by the police, Jessica's parents sought help from the local media to draw attention to their daughter's disappearance. Along with family and friends, they began a search for Jessica and distributed flyers with information about her. The search was led by Jessica's father and his brother Stanley, both of whom knew the area well. Fearing the worst, they decided to search near a local river, an area known for its seclusion and frequented by drug dealers and criminals due to its remote and discreet location. For hours, Jessica's relatives combed through the difficult terrain near the river, but found no trace of her. The next morning, something strange happened. Jessica's parents were at home and their son was playing in the yard. Suddenly, the boy ran inside, saying he heard someone calling for help, and it sounded like his sister's voice. Jessica's father grabbed a gun and ran outside, trying to pinpoint the source of the cry. At the same time, his brother drove up to the house and quickly joined the search. Soon, they noticed smoke rising from their neighbor's property, a 40-year-old man named David Brooke. As they approached, they saw him burning something that resembled clothes on his land. This looked very suspicious, so Jessica's father asked Brooke for permission to search his property, but Brooke refused and told them to leave. This wasn't the only strange thing about Brooke. Before Jessica's disappearance, her family had maintained a normal relationship with him and his family. However, right after she went missing, Brooke began acting oddly. He would often drive slowly past their house, staring at them with a menacing smile. Jessica's parents also started receiving mysterious phone calls where an unidentified man remained silent on the other end, breathing heavily. They suspected Brooke was behind this, but couldn't understand why he would behave this way. After witnessing Brooke burning clothes, Jessica's parents decided to talk to the police again, despite their lack of interest in the case from the beginning. They shared their observations and asked the police to bring in a K9 unit. The police agreed to use Jessica's clothes to track her scent. The dogs led them to the burn site on Brooke's property but didn't find any substantial evidence. The dogs also found a pair of black gloves in a shed that emitted a smell consistent with decomposition. Throughout the search, Brooke continued to act suspiciously, but the police still didn't link him to Jessica's disappearance, and once again they left empty-handed. Frustrated with the police, Jessica's father decided to contact the FBI. Typically, the FBI doesn't begin investigations based solely on calls from the family of missing persons, but this time they immediately got involved due to the alarming events Jessica's parents described. After a thorough investigation, the FBI concluded that something truly horrific had happened to Jessica. From there, they began questioning numerous people, including David Brooke. During an interrogation, Brooke claimed that he had driven past Jessica's house that morning on his way out of town and saw her leaving the house alone. A friend of Jessica also testified that she had seen her sitting in a car with Brooke. The FBI asked Brooke to take a lie detector test, but he refused. However, this didn't stop the FBI from continuing their investigation into him. Brooke's suspicious behavior persisted. He frequently drove slowly past Jessica's parents' house, stopping to stare at them with an eerie smile. Jessica's mother reported this behavior to the FBI, who immediately requested another interview with Brooke. This time, the FBI conducted a more thorough search of Brooke's property. They found a box filled with children's clothing. In addition, they discovered that around the time of Jessica's disappearance, Brooke had spent a large sum of money on expensive items such as a new TV and a digital camera. However, in the end, the FBI couldn't find any solid evidence linking Brooke to the case, which forced them to close the file. The FBI also revealed that they had identified Brooke as a suspect but couldn't release this information publicly to protect the investigation. Years passed, and Jessica's case remained unsolved. However, her family never gave up and continued searching for the truth. They kept distributing flyers, organizing prayer vigils, and maintaining their faith that one day the truth would be revealed. Jessica's parents eventually divorced, unable to cope with the pain of losing their daughter. Despite no longer living together, they remained on good terms and continued to stand united in their search for justice for Jessica. During all this time, David Brooke continued to live in the local area and maintained contact with Jessica's family, leading many to believe that he was indeed involved in the case. However, no concrete evidence was found to charge him. On September 27th, 17 days after Jessica's disappearance, the police received a surprising call. A woman driving along the road near the river, where Jessica's father had searched in the early days, saw something strange near a tree and decided to check it out. As she approached, the woman realized it looked like a human body and immediately called the police. When FBI agents arrived at the scene, they discovered the lifeless body of a young girl, missing some fingers and toes. A rope with traces of red and silver paint was tied around her legs, and part of her clothing was missing, leading detectives to believe the attacker had sexually assaulted her. Due to the advanced decomposition of the body, they couldn't immediately determine if it was Jessica. An officer went to Jessica's house and asked her parents to help identify the body. Jessica's father couldn't bear to look, but her mother agreed. She arrived at the scene and initially couldn't recognize her daughter. However, she eventually saw a small butterfly tattoo, identical to Jessica's, in the same spot. Medical experts later confirmed the victim's identity and determined the cause of death to be strangulation. Several bruises were found on her body as well. The experts also revealed that Jessica's limbs and fingers had been severed post-mortem. But the most horrifying revelation was that Jessica had been alive for approximately 3 days after her disappearance. This meant that the police had had a chance to save her but failed to act. After the body was discovered, the FBI decided to interrogate Brooke again. This time they found something new. In his initial conversation, Brooke claimed to have seen Jessica near her house on the morning she disappeared. However, this time he changed his story, saying that he didn't see her that day. Brooke now claimed that he had been in bed with his wife that morning, but when detectives questioned his wife, her testimony contradicted his. The FBI continued to press Brooke, asking him what he would do if they found his fingerprints on the victim's body. Although no fingerprints had been found, Brooke's answer was suspicious. He said that if they did, he would have to confess everything. Brooke also failed the polygraph test, prompting the FBI to arrest him and prepare for a trial.
Chapter 1. The Nature of Emotions. Understanding Impermanence. One of the most fundamental teachings of Buddhism is the concept of impermanence, anicca. Impermanence is the recognition that all things, including emotions, are transient and subject to change. Emotions arise in response to external stimuli, such as experiences, people, or circumstances, and dissolve just as naturally. They are temporary states that come and go, like waves in the ocean. When we deeply internalize the understanding that emotions are impermanent, we can avoid getting caught in the emotional roller coaster that life often presents. We can stop clinging to positive emotions and resisting negative ones, recognizing that they will both pass in time. By doing this, we create space for emotional balance and can observe our emotional states without becoming attached to them. For example, if we feel intense sadness or anger, we can remind ourselves that these emotions are not permanent. Instead of reacting impulsively to these feelings, we can sit with them, acknowledge their presence, and allow them to dissipate naturally. This perspective offers tremendous freedom, as we are no longer at the mercy of our emotions, but instead can witness their ebb and flow without becoming overwhelmed. 2. Mindfulness. Observing emotions. Without judgment. Mindfulness, sati, is the practice of being fully present and aware of the current moment without judgment or attachment. It is one of the most powerful tools Buddhism offers for controlling emotions. Through mindfulness, we learn to observe our emotions as they arise, giving us the opportunity to acknowledge them without reacting impulsively or being consumed by them. Mindfulness teaches us to be aware of not just the external world, but also our internal emotional landscape. When we practice mindfulness, we can observe the early stages of an emotion before it fully manifests. For example, we might notice the tension in our body or the rapid racing of our thoughts as anger begins to surface. By observing these signs with mindfulness, we can take a step back and avoid acting on the emotion in a way that causes harm to ourselves or others. The practice of mindfulness allows us to create space between stimulus and response. Instead of reacting immediately to an emotion, we can choose a skillful response that aligns with our values and long-term well-being. This space is where true emotional control resides. We are no longer slaves to our emotional impulses, but can navigate our emotional experiences with clarity and awareness. A powerful way to cultivate mindfulness is through meditation. During mindfulness meditation, we focus on the present moment, often by observing our breath or bodily sensations. As emotions arise during meditation, we don't push them away or cling to them. Instead, we observe them with curiosity and non-judgment, allowing them to naturally fade away. Over time, this practice strengthens our ability to remain calm and composed in the face of emotional turbulence. 3. Emotional detachment through the wisdom of non-self. A central tenet of Buddhism is the teaching of non-self, anatta, which asserts that there is no permanent, unchanging self. According to this teaching, what we commonly refer to as the self is merely a collection of constantly changing thoughts, emotions, sensations, and perceptions. In relation to emotions, this teaching offers a powerful way to avoid being dominated by them. When we believe that our emotions define who we are, we often feel trapped by them. We might say, "I am angry," and feel as though anger is an intrinsic part of our identity. But Buddhism teaches that emotions are not the self. They are temporary states of mind that arise and pass. Understanding this allows us to create a sense of emotional detachment. Instead of saying, "I am angry," we might say, "Anger is arising within me." This subtle shift in language reflects a profound shift in perspective, allowing us to witness emotions without identifying with them. By viewing emotions through the lens of non-self, we realize that emotions do not define us. They are not fixed or permanent aspects of our being. This understanding frees us from the tyranny of our emotional states, enabling us to witness them without being consumed by them.
Hannah approached this lead with some skepticism, as prisoners often make such claims to secure early release or improve their conditions. However, she understood that she couldn't ignore the lead without verifying it. Hannah went to the prison and met with the man who claimed to have information. According to him, he had once shared a cell with an individual who had been convicted of child abuse, just like him. On this common ground, the two became friends and shared details about their crimes. One day, the inmate confided in him that, in addition to other things, he had murdered Jessica Disan. The informant then dropped a bombshell, revealing a shocking piece of information. Stanley Disan, Jessica's uncle and her father's brother, was the true culprit. According to the informant, Stanley had been sexually abusing Jessica for years while living with the family. He had threatened to kill her or someone close to her if she dared to tell anyone. In the spring of 1999, when Jessica got a boyfriend, Stanley began to fear that sooner or later she might confess to her boyfriend about being abused by her uncle. On the morning of September 10th, Stanley went to Jessica's house while she was alone. She was outside preparing to get into her car, having packed her belongings. Stanley approached her and demanded that she break up with her boyfriend, but Jessica refused and threatened to expose him if he didn't leave her alone. Stanley began to threaten her, and she attempted to call 911. Stanley tried to grab her, but Jessica escaped and ran into the house. He chased her into a room, struck her, and tied her up in bed sheets before taking her to an abandoned shack not far from where her body was later found. Stanley kept her alive there for several days, abusing and torturing her before finally killing her. He then moved her body to a visible location near the road and buried the bed sheets underground. After receiving this information, Hannah decided to verify everything about the evidence buried underground. Due to a lack of personnel in the local police department, no one could assist her. So she reached out to Jessica's brother and other family members, who agreed to join the search. She didn't tell them that Stanley might be the killer, as she wanted to find supporting evidence before making such shocking accusations. On the first day of searching, they didn't find any clues. Under heavy rain, they dug in the areas described by the informant, but had no success. The next day, Jessica's brother and Hannah returned to the scene. On the way, he pointed out an abandoned shack by the road. They entered and began digging inside the shack. Almost immediately, they had the breakthrough they had long awaited. They discovered a buried bedsheet. Hannah collected the evidence and rushed to Jessica's house. Over the years, her parents hadn't changed anything in her room, leaving it exactly as it had been on the day she disappeared. Thanks to this, Hannah was able to confirm that the bedsheet they had found was part of Jessica's bedding set. It was missing from the bed, and the other sheets had the same pattern. After this discovery, Stanley was arrested and brought in for interrogation. He refused to confess to the crime, although he appeared nervous during the conversation with detectives. Eventually, he was charged with murder, and the case went to trial. Jessica's father couldn't believe that his own brother had committed such a heinous crime against his daughter. He went through a period of complete denial, but eventually had to accept the unbearable truth. He then remembered that in the early days of Jessica's disappearance, it had been Stanley who suggested searching for her body near the river. However, during the search, Stanley had suddenly felt ill, and his brother had driven him back home. This had happened just a few hundred meters from the shack where Jessica was being held, indicating that Stanley had deliberately diverted them from finding her while she was still alive. During preparations for the trial, Hannah researched Stanley's past, hoping to find more evidence. She discovered that he had previously been convicted of assaulting another girl in the family. But then Hannah uncovered something even more disturbing. Other women in the family accused Stanley of sexually abusing them when they were young. The pattern of behavior was consistent. Stanley would tell relatives that he had nowhere to stay temporarily and ask to live with them. Once alone with the girls, Stanley would commit his heinous acts and threaten them to remain silent. After hearing all these stories, the police concluded that Stanley had been doing this for 3 decades. Even so, Hannah realized that securing a murder conviction would be difficult, as there was virtually no direct evidence against Stanley, such as fingerprints or DNA. She continued to dig into the case until she found an old box of documents she hadn't yet reviewed. When she went through its contents, Hannah was once again shocked by the incompetence of her predecessors. Inside the box was a letter dated June 26, 2002, from another informant. This informant had written to the police, recounting a story he had heard from a fellow inmate in Kentucky. 12 years earlier, in the summer of 2002, Stanley had been imprisoned for assaulting an underage relative. During that time, he had told his cellmate about killing Jessica. The cellmate, also the informant, had written to the police describing all the horrifying details Stanley had shared about what he had done to his niece. And what did the police do? They simply ignored the letter, perhaps still believing that Brooke was involved, and didn't bother to investigate other suspects. Once again, Hannah was frustrated by the lack of professionalism. If the police had been more diligent in their work, this case could have been solved in 2002. Now, after all these years, she could only wait for the trial, hoping that Stanley would finally face justice for his actions. The trial began in 2015, and Stanley pleaded not guilty. Jessica's parents could hardly look at the relative who had destroyed their lives. They were also furious that Stanley couldn't simply confess to bring them closure. The prosecution believed the chances of securing a murder conviction were quite low, mainly because there was almost no concrete evidence against him. There were also issues with the assault charges related to other girls in the family. All of them would have to testify in court, detailing Stanley's actions. Because of this, the prosecution decided to offer Stanley a plea deal. They agreed to drop the death penalty in exchange for Stanley confessing to both the assaults on his relatives and Jessica's murder. In the end, Stanley agreed and pleaded guilty under the plea agreement. He didn't have to disclose any specific details about the crimes. Jessica's parents, who had hoped to hear the whole truth, were unhappy with this, but Stanley remained silent. Under the terms of the plea deal, the killer received a 20-year prison sentence with the possibility of parole after 15 years. As Stanley was 56 at the time of sentencing, he could be released at the age of 71. After the trial, Jessica's father vowed that if his brother didn't die in prison, he would wait to deal with the matter himself. The story of Jessica Disan's case is a heartbreaking reminder of the carelessness and shortcomings in criminal investigations, while also being a call for justice for innocent victims. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments below, and don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching.